Living here in the Mojave Desert, where our water comes from is on the top of the minds of many Southern Nevadans. And today we want to dive into how weather and climate are impacting the Colorado River and Lake Mead and what it all means for our water supply living in Southern Nevada. Today we've got an amazing panel lined up for us today. From left to right, we've got Zane Marshall, Director of Water Resources from the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Next to Zane is Tom Romero, UNLV law professor with a specialty in environmental and water policy. So we're going to dive into the laws of the water. And Dr. Matthew Petrie, he's the head of UNLV's Dryland Ecohydrology Lab. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
So let's dive in. Zane, I want to start with you because as we look at where we're at now with water and where we're going in the future, I think it's important to take a look back at where we started. For the millions of tourists that come into Las Vegas every year, and even maybe some people that live here, they see us as a city in the middle of the desert, maybe with no business being here. But that's really not the truth. We've always been close to water with the Spring Mountains and with the aquifer underneath us. So if you could take us back a little bit, how the Las Vegas Valley found water and why Las Vegas is where it is when it comes to water.
So thank you for the opportunity today. So the history of Las Vegas, I think, starts in the early 1900s. Where development here started around springs, and that's how Las Vegas gets its name. The Meadows is from the springs near the Springs Preserve, or the center of the valley, and that supplied the community for a number of years. And then the community, once they exhausted that surface water, turned to groundwater. And groundwater was the supply for this community up until the early 1970s. And in 1971 is when the first large diversion off the Colorado River that supplied the municipal area, the community in Las Vegas, was developed, and we have been dependent on Colorado River water ever since 1971.
Okay, and that really coincides with how much growth. I mean, if you look at the population of the valley, even from the 1980s, early 80s, we were less than 500,000 people, and now we're at more than 2 million people. So was it mainly just the valley just kept growing, and that's when we had to start going to Lake Mead?
That's right. With additional population moving to Las Vegas, we've needed to provide additional water, and the Colorado River was where this community turned in the early 1970s. And through the 80s and the 90s, we continued to use more water. We've developed more infrastructure to be able to access our full allocation on the river, which is 300,000 acre-feet per year. And then in the late 1990s, we saw that there was a potential for us to exhaust that supply. And that is when we began to implement conservation measures here in Southern Nevada.
Yeah.
And in fact, in 2002, we were using more water than what we had in terms of allocation on the river, over 300,000 acre-feet per year.
And we're going to get into a lot more of that. And when we say acre feet, I think I want to kind of define that for viewers. The way I've always thought about an acre foot is you take a football field and that's a foot of water on a football field. Is that a good way to think of it?
That's right. It's about 326,000 gallons, or enough water to supply 3 homes here in the Las Vegas Valley for a year. Okay,
because I have a feeling that term will be brought up again in our conversation as we go along. So today, I know some of the resorts, that's one thing people don't maybe not realize, like the Bellagio fountains, they're still using water rights or groundwater from way back in the day. So some areas still use that groundwater. Not everybody's on the Lake Mead water supply. How does that fall in terms of the percentages now? Is most of the valley drawing from Lake Mead, or is there still some areas still using that groundwater
supply? So there
supply?
are domestic wells, and there is some groundwater development. In fact, the Las Vegas Valley Water District and North Las Vegas hold water rights to groundwater, which makes up about 10% of our water supply. But 90% of our water supply comes from the Colorado River. Okay, and of course, the Colorado River system fed by snowpack up in the mountains. And Dr. Petrie, I wanted to turn it over to you now because you specialize in the movement of that water. What eventually makes it into Lake Mead starts as snow up in the Rocky Mountains. Can you tell us a little bit about the winter snowpack, how we're looking up in the Rocky Mountains, and how important it is for that snowpack with our water supply?
I can to some degree. So the specialty of my lab is understanding the intersection of climate and weather dynamics and natural ecosystems. So you might think of multiple acres or a landscape of desert or forest. My lab studies how variation in weather and climate influences the functioning of that landscape. And part of our research is synthesizing climatological projections for the Southwest and the Western United States, understanding how ecosystems may respond. The current projection, well, the current situation we find ourselves in is the Colorado River Basin and much of the Western United States, according to the expert climatologists in the West, which are some of the best in the world. We've been in what is defined as a mega drought in the Western United States since about 2001. Mega droughts can be defined by their severity, their geographic extent, and their duration. And so while the Western United States or Colorado River Basin has not all locations have individually experienced a drought in every single year since 2001, over the geographic region, there has been a paucity of precipitation and especially snowfall in the Western United States Colorado River Basin that is primarily driven by anomalous sea surface temperatures. Droughts are a feature of the Western United States. It's one of the most drought impacted regions of the world. That is a natural cyclical process. However, there is evidence that the contemporary mega drought has been somewhat intensified by warmer temperatures across the West, and the current climatological consensus is that we are entering into a period where dry conditions, snow droughts, or warm season droughts will be more common in the future within the context of that decadal variation in precipitation that's a feature of our region.
So you're talking in terms of decades, because that's another big thing is for people that are really into the weather, you know, and a lot of people keep an eye on the U.S. Drought Monitor. And right now, I mean, it's been 20 years since the entire state of California is not seeing drought conditions. Now, that is the here and now, not talking about over the long range, like you just mentioned, over decades. I guess my question is, looking at the current conditions, like with the Drought Monitor, how does that all play in a part of, you know, just because we've seen above average rainfall, you know, we had several what we call atmospheric river events for California. They got hammered with a lot of heavy rainfall. Does that put a dent in the mega drought? Does that help a little bit? Or do we need to see this over year of this surplus of water and snowpack?
The best person to answer that would be a civil engineer that specifically knows the numbers for Colorado River flow. I think perhaps the insight that I could provide on that question is we're thinking about the entire basin, which is, you know, millions and millions of acres, and the cumulative or aggregate impact of precipitation across that basin that then all flows down to Lake Mead, to water resources for our city.
Absolutely.
And so determining, you know, what the break point is, how much precipitation, the geographic distribution, things like that. I don't have those numbers offhand, but it's going to be ultimately our water availability is dictated by where and what type of precipitation is falling across a really large geographical area.
And that tees us up for my segue into Tom, because what happens up the mountains, the snowpack, the precipitation, all of course feeds the Colorado River system. But the next is kind of shaped by rules and how much we get here in Southern Nevada and all of the basin states get. So Tom, I want to talk to you. There's a quote that's always stuck in my head. I think it's attributed to Mark Twain. It says, "Whiskey's made for drinking, water is made for fighting." And the rules of the basin go back decades. So I know you have such an expertise in water rights and in the law of the water. How did it start? When did it start, I should say? And what determined how much Nevada got out of the whole pie?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one we can start in a couple different places, but I think the easiest place to start is in 1922, and when we had the creation of the Colorado River Compact. And that is when the 7 states that make up the basin of the Colorado River, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Nevada, Arizona, and California, they came together largely to avoid litigation. There had been litigation that had been happening between Colorado and Kansas, Colorado and Nebraska, Wyoming and Colorado. And one of the concerns was the Supreme Court was deciding how to allocate this water. And so representatives from each of these basin states came together and said, we want to avoid the litigation. We want to get together and draft what's called a compact. And that becomes the Colorado River Compact. And in a really important level, that did a lot of things. One, it allocated among every state in the basin a certain amount of water. One of the challenges that we had at the time is it was done based upon hydrologic projections that were, let's just say, overly optimistic.
Okay.
And going back to the whole sort of way we measure water for this was those projections were based upon approximately about 17 million acre feet of water that would be available in the Colorado River Basin. The Colorado River Compact divided up 14 million acres, or let's see, 15 million acre feet of that water, which would then be distributed among the states. It then gets a little more complicated because we have the creation of an upper basin and a lower basin. And basically the lower basin is where Nevada sits, along with Arizona and California. And Nevada getting the smallest share of that in 1922.
Why was it the smallest share?
So I think one of the reasons for that, and it kind of goes back to the history that we detailed a little bit here, a lot of what was allocated were based upon hopes and aspirations about where growth was happening, agricultural growth, ranching, as well as municipal growth. And the two poles of the Colorado Basin, if you will, California and Colorado, had the largest sorts of production, economic production around agriculture, around ranching, and of course metropolitan growth. So there wasn't necessarily that same sense of growth, I think, that was going to happen in Nevada, certainly in 1922. I think there were aspirations among their negotiators for that. But Nevada ended up getting the smallest percentage of the allocation of the Colorado River. Now you layer on top of that a couple other things. A whole series of litigation that begins to happen, in particular between Arizona and California, that begins to operationalize this Colorado River Compact. You have additional compacts between the upper basin states. You have a compact between, or a treaty between the United States and Mexico, because the Colorado River flows into Mexico. And of course, what you also have too is the fact that the Colorado River Compact also said that it does not touch the rights of indigenous tribes. And there are about 30 indigenous tribes that sit along the Colorado River. So what we do know now is that, and this goes back to the historical averages, there's probably about 9.5 million acre feet of, at any one time, of Colorado River water. So from the very beginning, we've over-allocated water among all of the basin states.
Okay.
And that becomes then a series of agreements, operating agreements, that have the force of law between the states to really kind of manage what the structural deficit is.
Okay. And today there's a big decision kind of coming up here in mid-February that if the states don't come to an agreement, then the Bureau of Reclamation comes in and the feds get involved. Kind of where does that all sit right now? Take us to the here and now. Of course, it seems like it's always kind of an ongoing discussion between the basin states. What's going on right now, and what are you kind of seeing here over the next year? Because there's some decisions that are going to be made here after the end of this water year at the end of September.
Yeah, well, we're coming up to the end of a series of operating agreements between the basin states about the allocation of water, particularly between the lower basin states. With the expiration of that agreement, it's kind of, we either go back to the 1922 Act and allocate everything at the structural deficit, or we begin to account for some of these challenges of climate change. The basin states have been in close negotiations to try to hammer out agreement, really to avoid litigation.
Okay.
And federal government has come in. There is a federal authority that's arguably within the Colorado River Compact that allows the federal government to come in and potentially reallocate some of those allocations that were made as part of the Colorado River Compact.
Yep.
But what they've done now is basically they've suggested a series of really kind of allocations between the upper basin and the lower basin, and managing those allocations between Lake Powell and Glen River Canyon as well, in terms of kind of the least intrusive measure the federal government could take.
Yeah. And
really encouraging states to continue to negotiate and to really come up with a set of operating agreements that in some ways, and as we're kind of looking into the future, and maybe this is kind of how is operated, particularly in the last 20, 30 years, is a series of short-term solutions. Mm-hmm. Because what do we know is that climate change continues to happen in ways that we're still trying to account for. Yeah. And if we can account for and come to a series of agreements that allow us to operate 5, 10 years into the future, and we kind of keep coming back to the table, that might be the best of all scenarios and solutions.
So since the early 1920s, has the piece of the pie changed at all for Nevada?
Ostensibly, no.
Okay.
Ostensibly, no. Now, these operating agreements that I've talked a little bit about have basically Nevada and other states have agreed to diminish their share of the pie.
Okay.
In order to make sure the system continues to operate.
So I think it's safe to say, and I want to go back to you, Zane, as you mentioned it, early 2000s, we had to make some pretty significant changes here in Southern Nevada, especially. I mean, I grew up here in Las Vegas, and I remember in the 80s and 90s, everybody had a big lawn. The landscape looked a lot different, but there's been quite a few, over the last 25 plus years, there's been a lot of changes. And I think it's safe to say the Southern Nevada is a model for water efficiency in not only the country, but the world, really. We've had to live within our means because of what Tom just explained. So a couple things people always wonder is, okay, do we need to stop building houses? Do we need to stop the growth? Dive into a little bit. I want you to take us through water usage that we all use daily, showers, brushing our teeth, toilets, all of that is treated, it goes back to Lake Mead. The big thing has been the landscape, because once you water a lawn, that water you're not getting back. Take us through how SNWA has had to educate the public, make changes, and what you've done over the last 25 years in your agency to really face that piece of the pie that we get that hasn't increased at all since the early 1920s.
Right. So a little bit of history. So the Southern Nevada Water Authority was formed in 1991 as a collaborative entity, really to collaborate and work with the local municipalities to manage our limited water supply, which is only 1.8% of all the water that's allocated on the river among the 7 basin states in the country of Mexico. And in the late 1990s, our leadership saw that there was a potential for us to exhaust our resources, and we began to implement conservation measures like the Water Smart Landscaping Program, which provides rebates to remove grass, turf in landscapes. In the early 2000s, in 2002, we had the lowest flow on record in the Colorado River at 25% of normal. And quite frankly, that scared people a little bit, right? And it also caused the Water Authority and our member agencies to come together to develop a drought contingency plan and implement conservation measures that really help to conserve and improve our use of water in the valley. And I mentioned earlier that in 2002, we were using more than our Colorado River allocation, more than 300,000 acre feet per year, which meant that we were essentially out of water. Yeah. So the only way that we could support additional economic development and accommodate growth in our valley was to get better in the way that we use water. So today, about 45% of the water that we bring into the valley from Lake Mead is used indoors. And like you mentioned, we return it back to the river by treating it and discharging it back to Lake Mead. 55% of the water we deliver is used consumptively. It's used outdoors in irrigation and evaporative cooling and some other commercial processes. And so our conservation measures are focused on reducing that consumptive use so that there's more water available to the community to use indoors and for critical purposes, right? And to accommodate additional economic growth and development in our community. And the way that we've done that as a community is to provide educational resources so that people understand what they can do to conserve water, We have tiered water pricing that incentivizes reducing water use. We have rebates and incentives that help our community take measures like removing turf in their landscapes to conserve water. We have some restrictions, and in 2002 in that drought plan, we started to implement some of those restrictions, like seasonal watering schedules, time of day, day of week watering rates, right? So today, during the wintertime, we can only water 1 day a week and never on Sundays. We also had restrictions on new development so that there could be no turf in front yards, and only 50% of backyards could be in turf. And this was in the early 2000s. And those conservation measures made big improvements, right, in terms of our gallons per capita per day use of our customers, and our total demands for water declined as we were growing as a community.
Okay.
Right? And so today, we've reduced our consumptive use by 35% and our gallons per capita per day by 55%, while adding over 800,000 people to this community. So we've essentially decoupled water demand and population growth by becoming much more efficient and by focusing on those outdoor consumptive uses.
And you think that the conservation measures that have been put in place over the last 25 years, has that set us up to continue the growth here in the Las Vegas Valley?
Well, it gives us an opportunity to continue to allow additional economic development, but we have to be careful about how we develop as a community, right? And so recently we've put some restrictions on things like golf courses. So there's no new golf courses, right? We've also added additional additional restrictions on how much water a golf course can use. We don't allow evaporative cooling for commercial uses anymore. So all new development has to be dry cooled. There is no additional grass or spray irrigation in new development, with the exception of parks, schools, and cemeteries. And so by new development being even more efficient than existing development, we can accommodate some of that additional growth and additional economic development. We have also worked with organizations like the LVGEA and Governor's Economic Development, or GOED, to identify businesses that are interested in coming to Las Vegas that don't have a large water footprint, right? So there's certain businesses that are better or more appropriate for the Mojave Desert in Las Vegas, and others that have very high consumptive uses that may not be appropriate. So we're working with those economic development organizations to provide them information and analysis that they can make good decisions about the future of this community.
Okay. And Dr. Petrie, I want to bring it back to you. Talking about future growth and what we've seen in terms of change. Zane mentioned the water conservation efforts that we've done here in Las Vegas. Removing of turf and changing the way we live here. What have you noticed in those last 25 years in terms of how the whole system is working? I know you've done a lot of studying on, the climate change aspect and the growth of the valley. What's the main point you've seen change over the last 25 years here in Las Vegas when it comes to the work you've done?
Well, I've only been in Las Vegas for 7.5 years. So like I said earlier, a lot of my research focuses on natural systems, and part of the future growth and sustainability of a desert metropolitan area like Las Vegas is effectively balancing human quality of life with resource consumption and water and other aspects of environmental health for human populations. And so, one of the things that municipalities like ours think about a lot is how does the surrounding natural environment that we are exposed to, even living in an urban area, influence our quality of life and well-being. Things like high summer temperatures and dust and wind-blown particle pollution and things like that. These are all things that over future years will help to shape the quality of life for the people that live in Las Vegas. And so part of water conservation is probably the key aspect of that, but ultimately, as a community, planning towards human health and sustainable development are things that are challenging, but are ultimately important for the long-term health of the community here. So that would be my answer.
Okay.
To that.
And you know, Zane, you kind of, the way you described, you know, Lake Mead is, it's almost like a bank account. Like early in the early 2000s, I mean, we were running low in that bank account. Have we seen the bank account come up now with the conservation efforts alone? Has that, you mentioned some numbers, but if we're thinking about it in terms of our water bank account, our savings account, for us to live for, you know, decades and generations to come, how are we looking right now?
So Lake Mead is currently at an elevation of 1065 approximately, and full pool is 1224, and dead pool is at about 900 feet.
Okay.
Right? So it's about 30% full capacity. The lake is about 100 feet higher than it would be otherwise without conservation measures that Arizona, California, and Nevada have undertaken to bank, store, conserve water in Lake Mead.
And we were pretty susceptible, especially before that third straw was built. That can you talk a little bit about that in just terms of that other intake that I don't remember how old it is now, but it's relatively recent.
Right.
How important was that to get done?
So the Southern Nevada Water Authority's strategy for adapting to and dealing with changing conditions on the Colorado River is multi-pronged, which includes conservation, long-range water resource planning. We do a 50-year water resource plan every year and update that every single year. We also have built and planned for and build major capital infrastructure. And so the third intake and low lake level pumping station projects were initiated in 2005. And the purpose of that was to ensure that Las Vegas had access to its water supply to Lake Mead under all operating conditions.
Which means even at dead pool, we would be pulling water from Lake Mead.
That's correct.
We'd essentially be the last ones to pull water.
That's right.
Now, when we hear dead pool, you hear that term, and you know your mind kind of goes to this, you know, just the lake just not even there, like a little puddle. I mean, that's the way I think of it, and I'm sure a lot of people do. Visuals are such an important thing. You mentioned the water levels, full pool, plus or minus what, about 200 feet. That's how big the bathtub ring is around Lake Mead right now. It's a visual reminder for all of us as we look at the lake. I guess my question is this, two-pronged. Number one, what does dead pool look like? And number two, for those who have lived in Southern Nevada a long time, I hear from people all the time. I remember in 1983 when the spillways at Hoover Dam were overflowing with water. Can we ever get to that level again? I know it's kind of an opposite question, but I'd love to cover both of those scenarios and seeing kind of what you see in the future if that were to happen, and how likely, especially obviously the optimistic would be seeing the lake water rise.
Right. So there's a couple of things that happen at dead pool, which is a good reason for trying to implement conservation measures across the basin to avoid dead pool. One is that Hoover Dam cannot release water downstream to Arizona, California, and Mexico. The other is that it stops producing power essentially at about 900 feet, right? So the power plant, which is important to regional hydropower production, and so the basin wants to avoid dead pool as much as possible.
Absolutely.
Right? What does it look like? It looks like a much smaller lake, for one thing. Lake Mead is shaped like a glass in the sense that the lower the water level gets, the smaller the surface area is pretty significantly. And so we would be able to access our water supply. The intake is at an elevation of like 865, so quite a bit lower than what dead pool is. So we would be able to still provide water to our community, even at dead pool. But again, it's not a place that anyone wants to be.
Absolutely.
Right in the basin.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those. Obviously, you've got to plan for the worst case scenario at times, and you know, it's nice to know that we've got that in place.
Right. If I can add, that total project took 15 years to develop, from 2005 to 2020.
Wow.
And in 2020, within 6 months of finishing that project, we actually needed the intake because of reservoir elevations. And so today it's a critical part of our infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's, our success in implementing that was maybe a little bit of luck and some skill also, right, in trying to use the best available science to try to predict what risks our community had relative to lake mead elevations.
No, absolutely. And Zane, you've talked about the conservation efforts. I wanted to go back to the bathtub ring analogy, because I know so many people will ask that. Do you see a scenario in where we get the lake wall? I mean, obviously we'd love to see it, but how likely is that if the conservation methods and that we've been implemented continue and other states maybe use less of the water? Can we get up to that level or fill the lake up to a level that we remember from back in the 80s and 90s?
Well, the climate scientists have evidence to suggest that the Colorado River Basin is undergoing aridification. So there is not an expectation to have similar precipitation patterns that we've had over the past 100 years,
yeah.
right? And what the water managers are saying across the basin is essentially we need to learn to live with less.
Yep.
Because we expect to have less water available because of changing climates, increasing temperatures, reductions in runoff in the system. And so it's imperative that all of the states across the basin take measures to reduce their consumption and conserve where they can.
Yeah. And speaking of measures, Tom, I want to bring you back in the fold on the law side of things. Assembly Bill 356 is something that we'll be talking, I think, more about here as we go into 2027. Essentially bans using Colorado River Valley delivered by SNWA to irrigate non-functional turf starting January 1st of 2027. That includes decorative grass and medians outside businesses, housing developments with exemptions. And Zane, you mentioned some of this earlier for single-family homes, parks, golf courses, cemeteries, etc. Take me through the process of an assembly bill. Is this, you don't have to go through the whole thing because I know there's a lot of layers of that, but I guess what does it mean that the bill was passed, and how has that changed for residents here in Southern Nevada, whether it be in their neighborhood, and now that it's passed, what does it look like as it gets implemented here over the coming years?
Sure. Wow, so we need a political science here to tell you the particulars of implementing the bill. But of course, I think that the basics is you had this proposal that came up in committee, and you had a series of subcommittees, right, in the legislature, getting testimony ultimately to ultimately craft what becomes this bill, right, which, as I understand it, would basically, it creates a exact limit, right, that you cannot put this type of turf in new developments. Existing developments have to take turf out as possible. I'm not certain, we might know here if there are incentives that the state has to allow that turf to be taken out for turf replacement. But I think the larger idea here, like it is with most laws, is law is meant to incentivize a certain type of behavior.
Absolutely.
And if we think about going back to where we started out with the Colorado River Compact, that was based upon a larger system of water law that's called the Doctrine of Prior Appropriation that we see in states throughout the Colorado River Basin, including Nevada. And one of the larger ideas behind that is to use it or lose it, right? Mm-hmm. And in some ways, and I sort of talk a lot about this with my students, we have a 19th century system of water law with 20th century infrastructure, right, dealing with 21st century climate change. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is one of the most interesting innovations when we start talking about these types of land use laws to really incentivize and start changing behavior that is over 200 years old now.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about our 19th century doctrine of prior appropriation. And how do we start moving the needle in ways, and just tie it all back to how we use our property, right, and what goes on our property, in ways that can deal with this reality of much less water.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to using the water, we mentioned the small piece that Nevada gets. One of the things that I think people, especially living here in Southern Nevada, we've talked about how much we've done for conservation. Then we read stories about farms in other states that are growing alfalfa or hay, and they're exporting it overseas, and it's kind of, the term is virtual water, essentially, that water that's locked up and that's being shipped on out. Is there any way that, I don't know, I don't want to say Supreme Court, but judiciously speaking, any way the laws can change to recognize, okay, if we're in this mega drought, if we're in this situation where we've really cut back what we've had, can we change some of those rules for these other states?
Yeah, so our system of water law, right, as core basis, the doctrine of prior appropriation establishes a property right, right, and property is a function of state law. So what we've done is, we allow every state to determine, what constitutes private property and water rights within their particular states. And so if we go back and if we sort of think about what other states might be doing and then thinking about is, you can use water under a doctrine of prior appropriation as long as you put it to a beneficial use.
Okay.
And state legislatures can determine, in some sense, the boundaries of what that looks like. So it's a real interesting federalism question, right? Because certainly, here in Nevada, we're very strong about protecting property rights, right? And pre-existing property rights, the property rights, the water rights that the Water Authority has, the water rights that agriculturalists have and ranchers have, certainly mining interests have. And we certainly don't want other states and or the federal government to come in and tell us we can no longer use those rights in the ways that the state legislature has defined.
So yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with like the perspective we all have, right? I mean, we live in Nevada, we see what we've done, and to your point, the property rights, they go back decades. So I guess it's safe to say that they really can't be changed. Can they be changed in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the challenges, or maybe one of the opportunities we have, is exactly the ways that we think about water as property, the ways that other states, right, might be incentivized because you can market water, if you will, right? You can turn that water, right, each of those that H2O, right, into things that can be banked, things that can be stored in aquifers. You can incentivize, states can set up systems where, and maybe this goes to our future agreements, where some of this water is stored, it's maybe leased, it's by whoever has the water rights, so it can be moved to the places that need it most.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I want to send it back to you, Dr. Petrie, because what Tom mentioned is it's kind of like we've got this agreement, but we're all in this together. Like the aquifers, it's not just like it ends at the Nevada-Arizona state line. I mean, this is a network that spreads across the states. In your work, in terms of how water interacts with the environment and in the basin in total, my question is, what one state's doing, how much of an impact does it have for us here in Southern Nevada? Is that I know that's kind of a broad question, but I kind of want to get some more perspective in your research on how that works.
Well, so ultimately, a very small part of the Colorado River Basin that feeds Lake Mead is in Nevada. So our water resources here in Las Vegas are strongly influenced by what's going on in eastern Utah and southern Wyoming and in west of the Rockies and in Colorado. And so the natural and human influenced processes that increase or may decline, essentially river water flows headed towards us, are all impactful. And really the law is the way that use and allocation can be influenced. There's lots of different processes in addition to precipitation variation and a warming environment that influence how water comes off of the mountains and the deserts and ultimately gets to Las Vegas. We're seeing large landscape changes across the western United States associated with ecosystem diebacks and with expanding forest fires and things like that, all of which can reduce the amount of water that gets to Las Vegas. We're opening up essentially snowpack to greater sublimation, which is just evaporation from snow.
Yeah.
And so taking water out of the equation through a number of different processes that ultimately then goes into the human system of water rights and water allocation across multiple states, and ultimately comes to us in Las Vegas.
And I think there's a lot of, it's almost like a lot of layers to the onion. You know, we have to peel back as you really discuss these issues. And one of the things I was wondering, if we bring it back here to home in the Las Vegas Valley, is I saw a study that RTC did where they mapped out the places most impacted by heat in Las Vegas. And the East Valley is disproportionately really affected when it comes to the heat during the summertime. And of course, as you mentioned, how we've gotten warmer over the past decades. My question is there been any studies on, we've removed, you know, grass and turf, and I know there's measures when you do remove turf, you just can't put all concrete down. You got to put some desert-friendly landscape in there, because I took the lawn out in the back of my house a few years ago and got the rebate and did it. So, but has there been any studies, Dr. Petrie, in terms of taking out a lot of the grass and what we had for all these years? Has there been some changes in terms of that like urban heat island effect in Las Vegas at all that you've noticed?
So the primary place where desert urban ecology and environment has been studied historically is in Phoenix.
Okay.
And Phoenix had a very similar situation to us, where there were parts of the city that were warmer and that were cooler. And this was early to mid 2000s. And researchers at Arizona State University found that irrigated landscapes, swimming pools, things like that, the ability to pay to have a nice lush front lawn in Phoenix, Arizona was associated with cooler urban temperatures. Mm-hmm. In Las Vegas, it's a little more complicated because we have more elevational change, yep, right, between the east and the west and the south of the valley. But ultimately, physically, when you evaporate water, you have to cool the air a little bit. And so if we are needing to conserve water by reducing irrigated urban landscapes, ultimately, if you don't provide cooling through some other means, you will increase your air temperatures. Okay. And fortunately for us, shading, urban trees, things like that, shading provided by urban trees can to some degree offset that potential warming. That shading can provide a greater cooling impact, according to the studies that I've read, than simply the irrigation, the water that's moving through the tree.
And I think a great example of that is, I remember I did a live report. It was during the Golden Knights run in the playoffs for the Stanley Cup, and it was, you know, we were playing for the Stanley Cup in June, so it was really hot outside. But you look at Toshiba Plaza out in front of T-Mobile Arena, and you look at how, you know, the resorts did the landscape there. Zane, we could bring it back to you. I mean, that I think is a prime example of that shade point. You know, you've got a lot of, you know, pavement that's been laid down, but the matter, if you take it, next time you go to T-Mobile Arena or you're walking outside New York or Park MGM, take a look at the landscape, because those are desert, drought-tolerant trees that do provide that shade. And that is that the direction that really we've wanted to go with the mitigation measures we've made? Yes,
absolutely. So I think it's important to know that in general, the region is getting warmer. And 2024 is a good example of that, right? Where we had the most extreme summer on record with 120 degrees Fahrenheit in one day and a week over 115. And the primary driver for urban heat island effect are the hard surfaces, or pavement, concrete, buildings, dark colored roofs, right? Those are the real drivers to urban heat island effect. And the way to reduce that impact, one of the primary ways is with shade, right? And so our Water Smart Landscaping program, in order for a customer to get a rebate, they have to replace grass with 50% shrubs and trees. And last year we started a new rebate program where we provide an incentive, $100 per tree, for customers to plant trees up to 100% canopy cover. And we've incentivized over 9,000 trees to be planted in the community, over 3 million square feet of shade, right? Yeah. And we're working with other nonprofit organizations like Impact NV and Nevada Plants to help them also give away and plant more trees in those heat impacted areas in the Las Vegas Valley. So shade is the key. Yep. And I think trees are really important to protect. The valley is having some issues with things like sooty canker, which is a fungus that attacks trees, and root borer insects. As the trees are affected by heat, they're more vulnerable to disease and infestation. And so it's important for people to, to have an arborist take a look at their trees when they want to do a conversion, do a health assessment, and determine if those trees are going to survive a conversion or not. It might be a good time for them to replace those trees if they're in poor health. And if they're in good health during the conversion, they need to take care of those trees. They need to be careful that they're not damaging the roots and the trunks of those trees, that they're providing sufficient drip irrigation. And drip irrigation is the key in terms of conserving water, right? Moving from spray irrigation to drip irrigation.
Absolutely. And
those trees need to be irrigated during the conversion. So don't allow your landscaper to just turn off the water and let the tree try to survive through the couple of months through the summer, right?
Yep.
Provide irrigation and make sure that the drip irrigation is there when the conversion is complete. And that's really important. And it's also important to get expertise, like a certified arborist to help in those conversions.
Okay. And speaking of the conversions, I want to bring up kind of the flip side. We've heard from viewers, and I know that you guys deal with at SNWA from the public is, not asking to comment on any pending litigation here, but there's been people that have kind of been outspoken about excessive use fees for water, taking out this grass, and it's causing trees to die. We're hearing a lot, not a lot, but we're hearing that from people in the community. From your perspective, how do you balance out the conservation side of things, the rule of law with the Assembly bill getting passed, but also not too much overreach for citizens that live here in the Las Vegas Valley?
Right. So it's a bit of a balancing act, right?
Yeah.
In terms of navigating the need for us to adapt to changing conditions on the Colorado River, which is what our conservation measures allow us to do, and also be able to meet the future needs of this community in terms of economic development, accommodating some growth in the valley. And so our conservation measures, like I mentioned earlier, are 4 tiers, right? So there is the education program, so that people are aware of the opportunities that they have and the things that they can do to conserve water. Tiered pricing, which helps to incentivize customers to reduce their use. The rebate programs, so we do have rebates for non-functional turf. Today they're $2 per square foot for the first 10,000 square feet and $1 after that with no limit. And we have incentives for smart controllers, so smart irrigation controllers will pay up to $200 or 50% of the cost of the controller. So we have a number of incentive programs that help to fund or pay for those conservation measures that really do make a difference.
Yeah.
So an example, like turf is, a square foot of turf or grass uses 73 gallons per square foot per year. When you convert that to a water smart landscaping, to a desert adapted landscaping, it uses 18 gallons per square foot per year. That's a savings of 55 gallons per square foot per year. It's huge, and it is impactful, and we see that in our consumptive use in the valley. Last year we used 180,000 acre feet of water in our community, in the Colorado River water. And I mentioned earlier that in 2002 we were using over 300,000 acre feet. So we've reduced our consumptive use by 35% by focusing on those conservation measures that are really meaningful, like the removal of grass in the valley.
Would you say overwhelmingly, I mean, because always, there's always going to be critics whenever you're doing a change like this. Would you say that the response has been more positive than negative from people living in Las Vegas?
It's certainly been positive. And I think it's also important to know that our conservation strategies involve basically all aspects of water use in the valley, particularly those consumptive uses. It takes everybody to really make the difference. So we're not focusing specifically on single-family homeowners or businesses or resorts. Everybody has a part to play in achieving our goal of 86 gallons per capita per day by 2035. And so our range of incentive programs and conservation initiatives are intended to bring the whole community along to achieve those objectives.
Okay. Well, as we kind of wrap things up, I want you all to kind of put on your forecasting hats here real quick. I'm not going to ask you to give the weather forecast, but I want to answer this like a forecast. We've got the 3 C's: confident, cautious, or concerned about Southern Nevada's water reliability over the next 10 years? And give me a reason why you answered that. So again, confident, cautious, or concerned about Southern Nevada's water reliability over the next 10 years. Dr. Petrie, we'll start with you.
Cautious.
Okay.
Yeah, middle of the road on this one. So the efforts that SNWA has put towards water conservation in the valley are unprecedented, not just in the United States, but really globally. Las Vegas is a center for water conservation in the world. The situation that we find ourselves in with droughts and landscape change and declining water resources are a future that we're going to need to live with. But ultimately, there are human-based ways to ameliorate some of those risks and to learn to live with them, is my perspective.
Okay. Tom?
I would build on that, cautious as well. And I think just to really kind of go to the point of what's been happening here in Nevada. So my experience with water law, I talked about the fact we have this 19th century system with a 20th century infrastructure, but whenever there has been push, whenever there have been challenges, what do I know is that water brings a lot of people to the table.
Yeah.
And everybody speaks water, no matter where you're at, maybe a little bit differently, maybe with a little different accent, a little different inflection, some different needs, but when you get people around the table to talk water, they come up with some very creative and far ahead thinking solutions. And I think we've seen that here in Nevada. I think we're going to continue to see that here in Nevada, particularly with the way conservation and reuse has been happening. My hope, my cautious hope here is that this is also going to be motivating everyone else that's coming to the table as we think about the fact that, just as you mentioned, as we talked about, water does not know state lines,
yeah.
right? The Colorado River doesn't know state lines, right? Whether we're talking about domestic lines or international lines, aquifers don't know state lines. And so we're going to get a lot of people to the table, and hopefully I'm cautiously optimistic that there's also going to be a lot of courage to think creatively, to also understand that some of our 19th century thinking, our 20th century infrastructure needs to adapt.
Yeah.
And if you look at the history, I think that has always been the case. But it's a little painful to get there, and I think we're in the middle of that. But I do think we're going to see some really creative solutions coming on the table very soon.
It sounds cautiously optimistic to me right there, Tom. I love that. Zane?
So I'm confident with a caveat.
Okay.
So I'm confident because this community has done such a good job in terms of reducing our consumptive use on the Colorado River, and we really are making progress to achieve our goals over the long term. We have also banked resources. So we have 12 years of demands banked in the local aquifer here in the Las Vegas Valley, in Lake Mead, in Arizona, in California, that we can call upon in times of shortage and if we need it, right? We also have an arrangement with Metropolitan Water District for a permanent water supply. We're working on a collaborative project that is called the Pure Water Project, and it's an advanced wastewater treatment facility in the LA area. We're providing some financial resources to Metropolitan, and we would get a 25,000 acre feet portion of their Colorado River allocation. And that's an important part of our long-term planning, right? So the caveat, though, is the wild card of the Colorado River negotiations, right? And so there's still work to be done there. The states are still meeting, they're still negotiating. The federal government is still pushing forward, but there is some risk there, right? In terms of how that all comes out and, and the potential shortage that Nevada might have to take, on the river in the future. So I think cautiously optimistic, right?
Yeah.
We've done as much as we can do as a community and are pushing hard to achieve our goals and be more resilient to change on the river. But what actually happens in the negotiations is still uncertain.
And if you all had to pick one thing for everyone watching, and especially those that live in Southern Nevada that are really interested in this topic, because water is life, really. I mean, when it comes down to it. And what's the one indicator that you think needs to be watched most? Are we talking Lake Mead elevation, the Rocky Mountain snowpack, or more of the law side of things, the agreement side of things? What do you think the one thing obviously it's a multi-pronged, there's a lot of layers to it. But what's the one thing that, going forward here the next 10 to 20 years that people that really want to stay on top of this should look at?
So I do think both are important, obviously, but Colorado River snowpack and runoff are the key drivers to what happens across the basin. It's important to mention that with increasing temperatures, we receive a lesser percentage of runoff, even when snowpack can be close to normal, right?
Okay.
So like this year, right now, we're at about 74% of normal snowpack, and we expect about 68% runoff is what the projection is, but a lot can change between now and the end of May. So cross your fingers and hope for the best.
In an ideal situation, say, and one more follow-up question to that, how many seasons of above average snowpack? I mean, obviously we'd love to see every season with above average snowpack, but given the conditions of the mega drought and the change we've been seeing, what does it take to really say, wow, that was quite the dent that Mother Nature gave us here over the last 5, 10, 15 years? What is it going to take to say that going forward? Is there a threshold? Is there something we can? I guess it's kind of a moving target, essentially.
So we have had really big periods of precipitation and snowpack in the basin, and that is in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when there was really high levels of precipitation, when Lake Powell essentially filled up, got to full capacity, and flowed over the dam. We don't necessarily expect to have huge years like that in the future. They could happen, but it would take many years of above normal snowpack and runoff to fix the hole that we have currently in our two major reservoirs.
Absolutely. Tom, what's the one thing, I guess, out of those things that you're watching go for? You've kind of hinted on it already, but it really sounds like on the law side of things, it's that agreement coming to the table, everyone coming together.
I think short term, that's it.
Yeah.
I think long term, and sort of give you an example of when I first started teaching water law, started teaching about the Colorado River, the law of the river. The estimates I was using at the time, this is about 22 years ago, was there was about 30 million people that are reliant on the Colorado River. Well, now we're talking 22 years later, that number's at 40 million. And rising, right? And so I think one of the things I'm always thinking about is how many more additional people, right, are going to be reliant upon the Colorado River system. What does that mean for everybody involved? One of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and I think we should be thinking about, is the connection between the water rights and the water quality. Because as you continue to add more people, you continue to build infrastructure, you also need to continue to have water that's clean and safe for people to have. And how do you pay for that, right, as one example. So I think that will be, certainly it's the questions of water quality and water rights are ones that are going to continue to, I think, come to the forefront in the coming decades. And certainly the water authorities, but also counties that are outside metropolitan areas, they're thinking about this in terms of access to groundwater, if you're talking about mobile homes, as one example. This is going to continue to be an acute problem as population grows.
Absolutely. And Dr. Petrie, we'll wrap it up with you. What's the one thing you really keep an eye on?
I have class starting tomorrow, so I'm going to get a head start on this semester and give you an answer that I often give my students in class, and that is things that fall outside of you, whether they're science or human society, can often seem more alarming than they are, and take advantage of the information that you can get from multiple resources, from the scientists at the university, from SNWA, from the people that are working on these topics. If this is something that is interesting to you, take advantage of informing yourself on the issue, and it can help you gain your own perspective on the issues that we face in natural systems and society and other aspects of life that can benefit you and can help you feel like you have a little bit more of a handle or a little bit more control.
I love that. I think that's a great way to wrap it up. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time today. Really great discussion. From Fox 5 here in Las Vegas, I'm Chief Meteorologist Sam Argier.